Waking Up is Not Enough. Flourishing in the Human Space, a podcast by Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger. When you peek into the cosmic unity of existence and feel the love and inspiration of awakening, what happens next? Whether it's through meditation, spiritual practice, near-death experience, ingesting a mind-altering substance, or being born again, you don't get a map for improving your messy life. In this podcast, Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger draw on expertise in science, psychology, adult development, psychedelics, NDEs, dreams, and Buddhist practice in conversations about compassion, resilience, responsibility, kindness, and development after awakening. You will learn how to chart a new path for flourishing in the human space, in which waking up is important, but not enough, and growing up is never finished. Co-hosts Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger bring different kinds of expertise. Polly is an author, psychologist, Jungian analyst, longtime Zen practitioner, couple therapist, and founder of Dialogue Therapy and Real Dialogue. Michael Berger is an entrepreneur, an expert in psychedelics, a spiritual practitioner of Jewishness, a skeptic, a Real Dialogue specialist, and a filmmaker who is known for his documentary, Improbable Collapse, The Demolition of Our Republic. Polly and Mike will engage with each other and invite a wide array of guests who are accomplished scientists and seekers whose work lies beyond the hegemony of materialism. A conversation with Donald Hoffman, Ph.D., Conscious Realism, Real Dialogue, and Human Subjectivity. What do you believe about consciousness? Do you think consciousness is produced by your brain? Perhaps you're aware that there is no scientific evidence that consciousness arises from a material source like a brain. In this podcast, Polly and Mike dive into a complex conversation with scientist and seeker Donald Hoffman, who's an American cognitive scientist and psychologist, as well as a popular science writer. He is professor of cognitive sciences, philosophy, and computer science at the University of California, Irvine. In his current scientific investigations, Donald Hoffman proposes that the fundamental building blocks of reality are not particles or atoms, but conscious agents. He also advocates for a radical shift in our understanding of the universe, suggesting that evolution has shaped our perception to prioritize survival rather than truth. This thought-provoking perspective challenges our beliefs about reality and raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. In this conversation, we explore the meanings of space-time, dialogue, the nature of reality, as well as consciousness and the way it expands and changes through our relationships with each other. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Hoffman.
Thank you very much, Mike and Polly. Thank you for having me on.
Hi, Don. It's great to see you again. I want to start with a question, which is really more of a prompt or an invitation. If you could summarize for our listeners kind of an overview of conscious realism, which is the theory that you investigate and have originated, and bring us up to date about its findings.
Okay, certainly. So most scientists are physicalists, and that is they assume that space-time and objects inside space-time are the fundamental nature of reality. And this is the foundation of the standard model of physics with its bosons, leptons, and quarks, and so forth. And it's also the foundation that my cognitive neuroscience colleagues use when they're studying consciousness. They assume that physical systems are fundamental and consciousness is a latecomer, and that somehow complex physical systems like brains give rise to conscious experiences. But conscious realism says that metaphysics, the assumption that space-time is fundamental and physical objects inside space-time is fundamental, that metaphysical assumption is false. And it's quite fascinating that high energy theoretical physicists are now saying the same thing. This is relatively recent. In the last 20 years, 20, 25 years, they're saying that space-time is doomed. And that's a quote. Space-time is doomed, from David Gross, a Nobel Prize winner for his work on quantum chromodynamics, Nima Arkani Hamed, who's at the Institute for Advanced Study. They're saying for technical reasons, not for spiritual reasons, but for technical reasons, that space-time is not fundamental, and therefore objects inside space-time are not fundamental. And they're not just waving their hands up and saying, "Oh boy, well, it's all over." No, they're actually, this is great. They're looking for new structures beyond space-time, and they're finding them. We can talk about that. But conscious realism, it says what the high-energy theoretical physicists are saying: space-time is doomed, and objects in space-time are doomed. They are not fundamental, and they will not be the foundation for science going forward. What I propose now, what I'm about to say departs from what the physicists are saying. So I've said, top level where we agree. What they're doing is they're finding mathematical structures beyond space-time. Those are really interesting, and I'm also looking at these structures beyond space-time. But what I'm proposing is a different metaphysics, a different reality beyond space-time, that it's consciousness, and not just the words consciousness. I mean, I'm a scientist, so I need to have a mathematical model. So I have a mathematical model, which, with all proper humility, is just a mathematical model. It's not the truth. It's just a mathematical model. That's the way science works. I'm not saying that my theory is correct or right. It's hopefully a good next baby step in science beyond space-time. But the idea of this baby step is to use the mathematics of Markov chains to model conscious agents that have experiences and that interact with each other, and as a result of the interaction, affect the experiences of other conscious agents. So think about this conscious realist view as like a large network, a large social network of interacting conscious agents, like the Twitterverse. And you might tweet and have followers and have other people that you're following, right? And that's sort of what I'm saying in this conscious realism thing. There's a bunch of conscious agents. They affect the experiences of other conscious agents. And so it's a big, vast social network. And space-time, and what we call the physical world, is just a device that some conscious agents use to deal with the complexity, right? If you have a huge social network like the Twitterverse, there's millions of users and billions of tweets. It's impossible for you to read all the tweets or to grok all the things that are going on in that, the millions of. So what we have are these nice little user interfaces. We look at what's trending and so forth, and get little hints about the complexity of what's going on. And so space-time then is just a headset that some conscious agents use. It's a VR headset that they use to help dumb things down, because it's too complicated. There's all these millions of countless conscious agents out there that you're interacting with. So you need something to simplify it so you can understand what's going on. And that's what space-time is. So to summarize, conscious realism says space-time is not fundamental. It's just a headset. It's a convenient way that we use to interact with a vast network of interacting conscious agents.
So I want to ask a question that I think intersects around the issues of conscious agents and science and dialogue. So science develops by investigating hypotheses, and especially, null hypotheses, disproving hypotheses, right? It's a method of investigating. And that investigation requires dialogue. It requires a back and forth communication that's sort of somehow trustworthy. Thomas Kuhn talks about the communities of scientists and the ways they investigate through making hypotheses and talking to each other. In a certain way, it seems to me from your theory that every one of these conscious agents, from the simplest to the most complex, through its kind of icon or interface theory of perception, has a hypothesis about what's real and what's not real, in a sense like a scientist, but not with, let's say, the degree of thoughtfulness or objectivity. But so that there are all these interactions going on within space-time that are producing different kinds of interface theories of perception. And I would say, like, the cockroaches are having their own, and the dogs are having theirs, and the humans are having theirs. And so the humans get into evolutionary theory, and the theory of space-time, and they get into Einstein and then post-Einstein and lots of things. But what I'm wondering is the way that conscious realism looks at those interactions in terms of how they weigh in on whatever it is that is emerging that we call space-time. Does the cockroach dialogue or hypothesis get involved with the human one? And then finally, this is sort of the other side of this issue of scientific investigation, hypothesis testing and being able to test, the kind of mathematical theory. And I think really always for science, it really is mathematical, isn't it? I mean, primarily the proofs are mathematical. But to do that kind of testing requires integrity. It requires honesty. It requires people, actually reporting their findings in an honest way. So there's a kind of ethics that often doesn't get languaged into the human system that is required for science to develop its theories. And and so here, because now I've become familiar with your work, I have these more complex questions, but I wonder how integrity or honesty, truth-telling fits in with this, human universe of conscious agents generating scientific theory. So there are a couple of questions buried in there, but one of them is, just the interaction of beings that are conscious. And the other one, in terms of science, testing hypotheses, where does integrity fit in? So I wanted to, I know this is not, an official question, but I've been wanting to ask this. So it just kind of came on board.
Well, you're right that scientists deal in theories and they do experiments to test those theories. And the theories in many cases are mathematically precise. Sometimes a science is not yet in the position to make really strong mathematical models, but usually that comes at some point in a science. And when you have these mathematical models, one thing to note about these scientific theories is that they make certain assumptions. So every theory says, grant me these assumptions. And then it says, if you grant me these assumptions, and I can make those assumptions mathematically precise, then I can explain all this other fun stuff. And I can do it with mathematical precision. And the math is there to show you the scope of your assumptions. What can those assumptions actually buy you? What can you do with them? And also the limits. The mathematics also shows you the limits, right? For Einstein's mathematics, together with that of quantum theory, actually tell us that space-time, which is a fundamental assumption of Einstein and quantum theory, that space-time is doomed. It actually tells us the limit of that assumption. It's doomed at precisely 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. It no longer is coherent. So there's part of the integrity, right? Is when you're not just bloviating and talking, when you're saying, here's my precise theory, and here's precisely where it stops. It stops at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. When you get there, then my theory can't take you any further. So that's part of it. And of course, then the integrity comes where other scientists have to, of course, learn the mathematics, and that's a non-trivial barrier for most people to learn the mathematics. I know a few people that I'm very jealous of for whom that's not a barrier, but it's a tough barrier. So that requires, and then to actually evaluate the mathematics and see that if it's logically coherent and if the conclusions follow from the premises. So there's an integrity check there, and the mathematics helps with that integrity check. But then when you come to empirical predictions, then you have the theorists and the experimentalists having to interact. So now the experimentalists there's an integrity there because the experimentalists need to understand what their predictions of the theorists are. And they have to talk back and forth so that the theorist says, yeah, your experiment will test my theory, or no, you need to change it in this way to have a real test. So, and usually, like some big experiments, like at the Large Hadron Collider, where they're doing particle collisions, there are hundreds or thousands of people involved in an experiment. So it's a big coordination. And there, again, integrity is a big part of the whole thing, where for example, they might have two different teams of experimentalists going after the same thing, and they don't talk to each other because you want to see if the two teams get the same answer. And they might even not let themselves see the data until it's all collected. so that there's no way that you can be fudging things. Oh, I don't like that. Well, let me change this. No, you do your experiment, you collect the data, but you don't get to look at it until you unwrap it. And then the other aspect of the integrity is that only if your result, in the case of physics, for example, is what they call 5 sigma, a 5 sigma result. The probability that you got this result by chance is infinitesimal. 1 in millions. Then they will say that this is a real thing. But you, of course, need to have, in things like that, you need to have integrity at all levels. The theory, building the experimental apparatus, actually the collection process, the analysis of the data, and then having people double check every aspect of it. So yes, integrity is required at every step, but there is some, I think most scientists are, of course, just genuine searchers after, the next good theory, and really want to, so that integrity is not really an issue for them. But if integrity was an issue, if someone had some tendency to want to cheat, there's another aspect of it, and that is you will be found out. If you cheat, you will be found out eventually. You may be able to have a good career for a decade or something like that, but eventually you're going to be found out and you won't get away with it. So there's that, because see, and this is what's unique about science is, human beings have had theories for thousands of years, but not mathematical theories. That's mostly, the big takeoff is after Galileo, basically, where we started doing mathematical theory. With mathematical theories, you see the scope and the limits of your theory. And you also can't hand wave and say, I didn't mean that. Well, no, you wrote down this equation. That's what you meant. And you can't sort of hand wave anymore. So it's very, very powerful because you have a precise language, which we've never, just words of natural language are great, and we use them all the time. Scientists use them all the time, but you can always wiggle around. Oh, I didn't really, my theory, that's not what I really said. And you see that kind of nonsense going on in history where people are dodging and weaving, as opposed to, no, here it is mathematically precise. So if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and there's not much hiding. So that's all part of the integrity. A very, very precise language is not a trivial part of the integrity, because you're saying precisely what you're proposing, and it gives you no wiggle room later on. Well, I didn't really mean that. You can't do that kind of nonsense. Whereas with natural language, people do that all the time, and it's the human ego tends to like to do that.
Well, in the social sciences, which is what I've been in, and did my research in psychology, and Jane Lovinger directed my dissertation. She was a great investigator and scientist. The mathematical precision is just not there. There are, of course, statistical tests and so on, but with the way multivariate analysis works now, which is called data mining, you can really demonstrate statistically lots of things. But I thought that from what you said previously and what you're saying now, you do seem to consider mathematics to be a different kind of language, like set apart, typically, from the sort of other kinds of language used for reporting, because it seems more precise and it can be tested more closely. And I wondered whether then mathematics for you is at a different level of truth. By and large, what I'm teaching and what I'm interested in is not mathematically precise. Yeah.
Sure. Right. Well, yes. Now, and you're right that, there are tricks that people can do, like data mining, and to try to find results that maybe aren't really there. And that's, again, part of the integrity thing. And psychology is particularly vulnerable to that. So you're absolutely right about that. On the other hand, because we have a mathematically precise notion of statistics, and we know exactly, when we talk about data mining, we can say with mathematical precision what you should do and what you should not do. And so in many cases, what we do is we go back and we find papers and go, oh, no. That's so again, you can do bad work for a while and get away with it for a while, but eventually it will catch up. In terms of, is mathematics a different language than natural language? What's remarkable about mathematics is the absolute precision. Once you have your intuition, so I'll take the example of Einstein. So Einstein, when he was doing his theory of gravity, he, in I think 1907, had the big idea. The big idea was, if I was in an elevator, standing on a scale, and I was weighing myself, and all of a sudden the cable was cut, and the elevator went into free fall, all of a sudden my weight would be 0 on the scale. That was the big insight. Now, it took Einstein several years, maybe 8 years or something like that, and he was Einstein, right? So this is he's not Hoffman. He's Einstein. He's a really smart dude. So it took him 8 years to turn that into mathematics, and he published it in like 1915 or something like that. And so he struggled and struggled to take this intuition, which anybody could say, oh, that's a great intuition. I must be an Einstein too. Well, no. It took Einstein 8 years to turn that into the field equations, which have revolutionized our understanding of space-time. A year after he published it, Schwarzschild, a German soldier actually in World War I, solved his equations and discovered what we call black holes. Now, Einstein didn't like it. He didn't think about black holes. He didn't know that his equations were going to predict black holes, and he didn't believe in black holes. So here's the key. The theory becomes the teacher. The person who actually wrote down the theory becomes the student. And that almost never happens with natural language because it doesn't have the precision to come back and tell you what you didn't catch logically. So that's what I love about science. As soon as I write down, I am now a student of my theory of conscious realism because it's mathematics. So I actually now go in there to study and understand what that theory entails. So I can't make it up anymore. I mean, I can add, but to the theory that is the central part of the theory, I now am a student of that. And if I don't like it, I'm going to have to rechange that whole theory, right? If I think it contradicts evidence and so forth. So it's in that sense that mathematics is a quantum step upwards in terms of scientific theories. Now, in psychology, which of course is my field, you're right that psychology has been slower to move into mathematical models. But in cognitive science, we're doing lots of now mathematical models for learning and memory and problem solving and intelligence and not just on the neural basis of it, but even just abstract models of how human cognition works. That aspect of psychology is now in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience is becoming highly mathematical, very, very sophisticated mathematical models that make non-trivial predictions. And it's not just what everybody's grandmother knows. It's really, really quite. So psychology is slower because human cognition and perception and emotions are complicated. They're much more complicated than particles, for example. And so it's taken longer. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I want to open this up for Mike to come in, and we want to open up to other issues about subjectivity. But I think the idea of hypothesis testing and also of having a theory, I think those ideas are pretty close to human development in general, from the earliest sort of sensory motor testing of the environment that the infant does, all the way to love, when you're sort of trying to test the other person's intentions towards you, right. Trying to figure out, do they have sincere intentions and so on. So I think the model is there. It's not as precise as it is mathematically. Part of the problem, and I think this again begins to be a problem that seems to suffuse itself through this whole issue of space-time, is the problem of telling the truth or integrity or the advantages that people have in trying to obscure the truth. I mean, the idea of that lying, for example, does indicate a smarter young kid than the kids who don't lie, because lying in the beginning seems like a pretty good strategy. It's just, you're just manipulating words. You're not changing anything. So I mean, partly what I have wondered about in thinking about this interactive network of conscious agents, and your agents, they perceive and then they decide and they act. So it's not a determined system. Right. It's always emergent. It's always changing as a result of that, I assume, from what my reading is, of that deciding piece in there, perceive, decide, act. Right. So this whole thing is evolving, this whole sort of space-time and the theory about it, it's evolving within first-person human experience, although other beings enter into that experience too. But there seems to be something about truth-telling, truth, integrity, that is involved from top to bottom in the ways that humans, let's say, can determine what's real. What's, like, people say, is that real? What do you mean real? Well, are you telling me the truth, or is this the truth? And so, I mean, one thing that we deal a lot with in this real dialogue is trying to get people to speak subjectively and to understand that their differences are human-based differences. It's not about something out there, but our experience as to what the truth is. And so, in that model, we don't have to kill each other in order to have effects on each other. We can talk, we can use words, we can use ideas, hypotheses to go back and forth to find the truth. And the truth is always emergent, it's never settled. And that's scientific truth as well as, I think, truth between people. But there's something about telling the truth, understanding the role of integrity. Mathematics will do that for you, essentially, because it's precise enough. But most of the time, humans aren't using mathematical hypotheses, but they're still using hypotheses, I think. I think hypothesis testing is what we're doing much of the time when we're interacting, and especially when there's conflict or, that kind of thing. So I had always wondered whether within the model, the issue of integrity arises, and apparently it does, but not in the way I was necessarily thinking about it, that it was somehow key to, perceive, decide, act.
Right. In that model, it's any kind of dynamics could evolve, right? You could have deceptive dynamics right. So it's general enough that it allows, honesty or deception as part of the mathematics. One can, of course, design networks in which honesty is a feature of the network, but you can also design networks in which deception is part of it. But what your question does bring two other points up I want to just mention in response. One is, and this may be a surprise, I don't think that there is a scientific theory of everything. There's no such thing as a scientific theory of everything, and then there never will be in principle, because every scientific theory has assumptions.
Right.
And those assumptions are the miracles of the theory. That's what the assumption, that's what the theory does not explain. It assumes. And you might say, well, of course, I can get a deeper theory that explains those assumptions. Indeed, you can. And that new theory will have its own assumptions. And so you have this endless, it's turtles all the way down, right? Assumptions all the way down. And so my own attitude about science is it's the best tool we have for precise theory building. We don't have a better tool for precise theory building as human beings. It is the best. And the theories are not the truth. They are a perspective, a useful, most theories that scientists come up with are just wrong, right? But every once in a while you get one that's a very useful perspective, like a Newton or an Einstein, James Clerk Maxwell. You get someone who comes up with something, we go, oh wow, it's not the final truth, but boy, it sure is useful. Boy, that's really, so it's a useful perspective on things. So that's, I think, an important distinction. And the other thing I'd just mention is, in terms of deception and truth, evolution by natural selection, which is our current best scientific theory about the evolution of human behavior and animal behavior in general. That theory, and I love the theory, and again, it's not the final answer, it's not the truth, but we don't have, right now, science has no better theory than evolution by natural selection to describe the evolutionary origins of human interaction and honesty and deception and so forth. And what you find from that theory is that there are strong selection pressures to deceive, to lie, not just for humans, but plants lie to bees. Right? The plants lie. They pretend that the orchids will pretend that there's something that the bee can mate with. And so deception goes on all the time. So there are strong,
but it's not intentional deception, in the sense that there isn't the sense of, I know I am lying, but rather I'm lying, so that humans can know that they're doing this for a particular outcome, whereas the orchid is doing it.
That's right. We see lying and knowing that you're lying in humans, perhaps also in other primates as well. And there may be other, I think that we could find, but with flowers, I agree, it's completely debatable whether the flower is consciously trying to lie. And that gets this interface idea, right? My interface gives me a lot of insight into humans and their psychology, a little bit into primates, even less into, ants. And when I get down to flowers, I have to give up. I wouldn't exclude the possibility of cognitive deception, but I have no evidence for it, right? I think my interface is sort of given up when I'm dealing with plants to understand any conscious aspect of their behavior. There are strong this is one of the big themes that it was a big surprise from evolutionary theory, that in some sense deception and lying is an extremely powerful strategy that we use all the time. And even makeup is a lie.
I just want to understand part of the aspect of your theory with conscious agents. If I understood correctly, there isn't necessarily a need in your theory for a conscious self. In other words, at what level is the perceived decide act? It can be potentially unconscious.
That's right. There need not be some kind of self involved. It could just literally be experiences without an experience of a me that's having those experiences. So your interpretation is exactly right, but it turns out, so two things to say about that. First, we did that on purpose, because as a scientist, I want my fundamental theory to be as sparse as possible. I don't want to throw in the kitchen sink in my definitions. I want to have as minimal definitions as I possibly can, and then say, I'll build all this other stuff. So there's no notion of learning, memory, problem solving, intelligence, self in the foundational mathematics of conscious agent. There's only two things: experiences, and those experiences affect the experiences of other agents. That's it. I wanted to keep it absolutely minimal on purpose. And then that forces us to use that sparse framework to then build networks of conscious agents that might have a self, that might do learning or memory, problem solving, intelligence. Now, it turns out it's straightforward to prove that these networks of conscious agents are computationally universal. That means anything that you could build with a neural network, you can also build with a conscious agent network. So I could build a chat GPT if I wanted to. And if I had enough time and energy and data, I could build a chat GPT out of conscious agent networks. They're computationally universal. So I can do anything I want to, basically. But they're even more powerful than that, because they're actually beyond computation as well in their capabilities. They're Markovian networks, and the measurable sets on which the probabilities are defined need not be computable sets. So that's why right up front we knew that we weren't putting a self in there. And I think it's interesting. We don't really need a self in the foundation, right? We do need the experiences, and we do need a framework in which experiences can arise, which is really interesting from a spiritual point of view. So mathematically, we actually had to put down that which allows experiences to arise as part of our mathematics. But beyond that, we didn't really need anything else. And so learning, memory, problem solving, the self, intelligence, all these things are going to emerge out of networks of conscious agents.
And I think also in terms of the flower, I guess, in one sense, what we understand now, for example, about what's going on with mycelial networks beneath the ground, that you see these are coherent, integrated systems that communicate bidirectionally. It seems certain species of trees will send nutrition to and can identify their offspring to help them grow. And they warn them about certain, I guess, potential invaders. So there is a much deeper level within which these systems do communicate, and whether or not, quote, they have intention is outside of the scope of this. But you can have these systems even without a sense of self. They really require awareness.
They seem to be exceedingly intelligent. We think that these trees and mushrooms and things are just bumps and logs, and they're dumb as a stump. And it turns out that there is hard negotiation going on underneath the ground. It's like hard trading going on. I'll give you these nutrients if you give me that. It's no nonsense down there. And plants have gotten a bad rap. There's a researcher named Monica Gagliano, who has I highly recommend her work. She's found that plants can do classical conditioning. They actually can learn by classical conditioning, and we underestimated the plants, and that's why I was agreeing earlier on that we can't say that the flowers are deceiving, but I can't rule it out yet either.
Right.
There's a sort of a wrench that I want to throw in here that is based on your theory, actually, which is that we're attributing from the human interface.
Right.
And so all of this attribution about this is doing this for that, and this is doing that for this, and so on, is our own attribution. And the attribution of intentionality is well known from Gestalt psychology onward. You just have to see a stick moving in a certain way or a line moving next to another line, and you say,
Right.
oh, that line is making that other line move.
Right.
Or, this is one that I like, a rock drops on your head and it hurts, but you look up and see a person sitting in the tree and you feel that person dropped the rock, even though that person might be sitting there and the foot kicked the rock off of a branch. I mean, our desire as humans to attribute intentionality is very, very high.
Mm-hmm.
And when we attribute it in a way that includes another human, we have a whole different reaction than if we think it happened to us as a result of the root of the plant. So our system, our way of thinking, has buried within it a lot of attribution about intentionality. And that's in our icon. You say, maybe the human body is an icon. I mean, I really agree with you on all of these things, but I think also humans make the mistake of thinking the body is what we call the self.
Right.
And that mistake then also includes a lot of attribution about what selves are doing to each other. So I guess I really just wanted to throw it in that unfortunately, as humans, one of our preoccupations is to attribute intentionality. And so I often wonder in some of these theories about plants, some of the theories about roots and mushrooms and so on, these are human theories. If it were possible for us to know the mushroom theory, it might look quite different because, there's an interactive network. And the interactive network is more complex than we can comprehend. And there may be aspects to that network that really function quite differently from what we're attributing. I agree a lot with Yuval Harari's theory of humans having this large attribution about fictional things. So that we believe what we're told about something that we didn't see and that we haven't experienced. I don't think there's anything that I know about in my dog or any of my domestic animals that is similar. In other words, I can't say to the dog, I saw your friend this morning and he took your bone, and the dog is going to be angry at that friend the next time he sees the friend. We have, because of the human self, we have a lot of characteristics that have to do with what, I would just call fictional attributions, that we believe. For example, if I believe that I'm related to all Americans, that somehow that stands for something, that's an attribution that has nothing to do with anything except my belief, but I might fight for it, So to me, that sets us apart from animals, from plants, from a lot of other, what I would say, they're conscious or they're sentient. I don't think they're conscious in the way that I am conscious of being an attributional being that does all this stuff. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you that when we talk about, informally plants deceiving each other or driving hard bargains and so forth, we're using human language for the plants, and that's not a scientific theory to say it, to put it in that language. So I completely agree. What you can see are just the transport of carbon and other nutrients, and notice that they satisfy certain optimal economic conditions, which is really interesting. So you can see those kinds of things, and that's a little bit more objective. But yeah, the attribution of intentionality, I agree, is fallible. I think that we have evidence in some species where we can see that there's intentional deception. In monkeys, for example. Right.
Yeah. I think in certain kinds of, I've heard about, I don't know, some kind of snake, I can't remember, that spits up blood and pretends to be dead when a hawk flies over. And, it looks very much like what we would call intentional deception.
Right. A piece about a fox and I think a crow, where the fox has caught a mouse but hasn't eaten it yet, and the crow wants it. So what the crow does is pretend to be wounded. So it's there, it's flopping.
Yeah.
And the fox is going, wow, a crow is a much bigger meal than this little mouse. I'm going for the crow. And so he keeps going and drags him further, and so far away that then the crow can fly and get the mouse before the mouse can get back to it. And so there, I mean, again, you could argue and say, well, no, that's just an evolved behavior, and there's no cognition on the part of the crow. But it's also open to the possibility that there is, an intention there. Who knows? But I would also say that the issue of the ego is an important one, and part of the issue of the ego in humans is that I'll use the virtual reality metaphor that we talked about earlier. That space-time is just a headset. If space-time is just a headset, it's not the truth. Space-time is doomed. It's not a fundamental reality. Then everything I see inside space-time, all the objects are just things in my headset. And like if I'm playing like Grand Theft Auto, virtual reality Grand Theft Auto, and I look over to the right and I see a Ferrari, a red Ferrari. Well, that red Ferrari only exists when I look at it. I render it, and then as soon as I look away, there is no red Ferrari. And if you look in the supercomputer, there's no red Ferrari inside the supercomputer that's running the game. So that the Ferrari only exists when I look at it. Now, the same thing is true of my body. It exists when I perceive it, and it doesn't exist when I don't. It's my avatar in my headset. It's an illusion, as you were saying. It's an illusion. The ego is the illusion of identifying with that avatar. When you identify with that avatar, that's and by the way, that's where physicalist science comes from. Physicalist science says space-time is fundamental, and I am my avatar. I am this little body inside space-time. And the spiritual traditions are telling us, no, you're not the avatar. You are the consciousness that is making this whole visual experience, this whole sensory experience possible, including that of the avatar. So brains, for example, do not exist. They're not perceived, and brains cause none of our behaviors and none of our activities. Now, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I've published with collaborators, EEG, fMRI. I'm very interested in the brain because I think the brain is far more complicated. Cognitive neuroscience is far more complicated than we thought. We look inside heads and we see brains. We think, okay, so neurons and brains and so forth, that's the reality. No. That's the interface description of a much more complicated reality. The interface is there to dumb things down. So the brain that we see is a dumbed down description of something that's far more complicated. So we thought the brain was complicated. It's nothing compared to what we're going to have to understand. We have to reverse engineer the brain and neuroscience to understand what's beyond space-time that we see as a projection as the brain. So you can see that what I'm suggesting here is not just like good spiritual stuff to recognize that space-time is not fundamental and you're not your body. If you don't recognize that, you're getting in the way of science. For science to progress, we have to get rid of the illusion that our bodies are what we are and that our brains cause our behaviors. These are just interface, dumbed down descriptions of something far more complicated. Until science understands that, they have the blinkers on. Science has the blinkers on and can't get on with the business of finding out the structures beyond our headset. Spiritual traditions have been there for thousands of years, but they haven't had the math, right? You need the math to really do the scientific approach to go beyond space. As soon as scientists really understand that space-time is doomed, they understand what the spiritual traditions have been saying for thousands of years, then the blinkers are off and science is going to really transform human society. I can't wait.
Thank you for listening to Waking Up Is Not Enough. To explore further, go to www.realdialogue.com, where you can download our free app and become a part of our online community. Purchase any course in the Real Dialogue app, and you'll receive an email invitation to our monthly conversation, where Polly and Mike hold an Ask Me Anything monthly on Tuesdays. Waking Up Is Not Enough is produced by Chris Coltrane and is available on all major podcast channels. And I also would like to just take a moment to announce the upcoming foundational training in Real Dialogue and Dialogue Therapy being held in Stowe, Vermont at the Trap Lodge. Session 1 begins November 30th. There are 3 4-day sessions in the next training. Session 1 is November 30th to December 3rd. Session 2 will be February 1st through 4th. And Session 3 will be April 18th to the 21st of 2024. For more information, you can go to realdialogue.com, and from the menu select Foundational Training. All the details are there. If you have any questions about the training or anything in the podcast, you can email me at mike@realdialogue.com.